Well, good afternoon and welcome to our first Meet the Author event at RTS Orlando. Purpose of these events is to introduce you to some good books and give us an opportunity to connect with prospective students, RTS Orlando alums, and also other friends and partners of the seminary. My name is Scott Swain and I'm the president of this campus. And I am delighted to welcome my colleague today, Dr. Greg Lanier. Dr. Greg Lanier is professor of New Testament at RTS Orlando. He comes to us with a PhD from Cambridge. He also serves as a pastor of River Oaks Presbyterian Church here in Central Florida. We're going to be talking today about his book, Is Jesus Truly God? How the Bible Teaches the Divinity of Christ. And Greg, as I'm sure you'll remember, when you came to guest lecture at RTS, the lecture you gave in one of our New Testament classes was related to some of the things in this book. And I remember our students coming up to me after class. I was chairing the search committee at the time, and they demanded that we hire you. So Greg thought a lot about
I have a great debt to those students, apparently.
Yeah. But anyways, it's really good to see this book in print, and excited to talk to you about it today and hear more from you about it. So the format is going to go like this. I've got some questions that I want to ask of Greg and hear more from him about what the book is about, what motivated him to write it, and what he sees its relevance to be. You have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. And the way you can do that is by submitting them through the chat function in Zoom. And then towards the end of our time, we'll have an opportunity to field some of those questions. The other very exciting thing we're going to do is do a drawing, and we're going to give away 5 copies of Greg's new book. And you'll see that.
And two copies of the cup?
Those cost extra.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see we've got these special Greg Lanier mugs. That was one condition when he joined the faculty. He said we had to have plenty of Lanier swag around. He also demanded that cold LaCroix was always available. And so
a minor demand.
It's a minor demand, but anyways, I don't know what to say about LaCroix. All right, so you ready? Let's jump right in. So this book is written for a popular audience, but it draws on some really high-powered academic work in New Testament studies. Tell us a little bit about the early high Christology movement.
Sure. So the movement that Scott's referring to is essentially a loose group of scholars, and many of them are friends, or at least academic colleagues, and it included some important figures, some of whom have gone to be with the Lord, such as Martin Hengel, the late Larry Hurtado, who died last year, Richard Bauckham. Those are kind of the big 3. And then there's a handful of others that are newer to the scene, such as Simon Gathercole, who are more sort of younger in their career and so forth. And what unites all of them, why they kind of had this name of Early High Christology Club, is that they were all, in their own ways, focused on going back to the earliest sources, namely the New Testament, even before that, to determine to discern and glean where do we see the roots of high Christology. So what do we mean by high Christology? That is the doctrine that in the creeds we confess as the full deity of Jesus, in addition to his full humanity. And so and I actually didn't even go to Cambridge to study this topic. I went to do something on Paul after my first conversation with my doctoral supervisor. That fell through, and I had to find something else. And one way or another, I providentially landed on this topic, and became very interested in this movement of scholars that were saying, okay, yes, Paul, the gospel authors, and so forth do actually give us a fully orbed understanding that Jesus is truly divine, that this wasn't made up in the 300s. It didn't come just with the Nicene Creed that goes back to the earliest days. And the reason why I wanted to then kind of popularize that is I hadn't really heard of these folks. And so I sort of heard some of the names, but when I started reading these books, I was like, man, this is awesome stuff. Well, I haven't heard of this before, reading Richard Bauckham's books and that kind of thing. And so I felt like there was a big gap in the pew, so to speak, to harvest some of these insights that are in many respects obvious to confessing Christians, but actually now how do we rigorously in an academic way defend these views? So that was really the origins behind trying to bring some of that to bear for a broader audience. The problem with a lot of it, not the problem, but one of the limitations that most of the writings that came out of this club, the early high Christology movement, were almost entirely scholarly oriented. So big, thick books, 600-page books, monographs, journal articles, and there was very little out there actually that took it and translated to something that your everyday person would even want to read. So.
Right. Well, and the thing that I appreciate about in reading the book, and it's really in the subtitle, how the Bible teaches the divinity of Christ.
Right.
Right. It's one thing to know that the right answer to the question is Jesus is fully God.
Right.
It's a very different thing to know how the Bible gets us there, because
Exactly.
the Bible doesn't give us a creed in the form of the Nicene Creed.
Right.
There are creedal statements and so
Right.
forth, but it teaches things in a different way. And so there's a sense in which, isn't there, that the different chapters kind of bring in different streams from the early high Christology movement,
Right.
and help us see how that teaches.
No, exactly. You know, I remember when you had made a couple mentions of this online, and I don't know who these folks were, but some snarky folks said, "Well, yes, whenever you mention
Right.
this book is coming,"
Right.
because of course the main title is positioned as a question: Is Jesus truly God? Well, obviously yes, and we've known this for nearly 2,000 years. And so you're right. Actually, the subtitle is the most important part of at least the first the cover of the book, because even if you look at surveys, and actually I mentioned a recent survey to this effect that just got updated for the 2020 timeframe. Any broadly Orthodox Christian knows that they know that the answer to that question should be yes. We affirm Jesus fully divine. But from especially from my own pastoral ministry, but even working with students who've been around RTS for a while, many, or even watching ordination exams.
Not students who've been around RTS. I want to.
No. Well, I mean, okay,
that.
folks who just, if they haven't had your classes yet. They know it's true, but the challenge that many of them have, and we even see this at ordination exams, they say, where would you go in the Bible to show that Jesus is fully divine in the way that the Nicene Creed and other creeds confess? People say, well, John 1, and then it's kind of crickets after that. And so the how is actually what I really wanted to focus on, and it really comes out of my pastoral ministry mainly. How can I equip people across the spectrum of Bible knowledge to give to know themselves, to be able to teach, to be able to apologetically, what have you, to be able to actually say, I know where the Bible teaches this. And yes, John 1's a big part of it. I kind of end the book in John 1, but I don't start there intentionally, to show that actually there's a ton of stuff in the New Testament and Old Testament that support this. And so each of the chapters is basically saying, here's one way or one how the New Testament does this, or the Bible more broadly does this. And it really is meant to equip people to be able to defend the assertion that Jesus fully God of God, etc., and be able to do that from Scripture in a robust way. So that's the real impulse behind the book. It's actually not meant to push. I don't have any sort of brilliant new ideas in the book, per se. That wasn't the goal. The goal of the book is to harvest all of that, like you mentioned, and equip people to be able to draw on that and say, okay, I can argue the deity of Jesus from here and here and here and here, and I can get my head around all of that.
Yeah.
So that's the real goal of the book.
Yeah. But don't undersell it, because it is something new to gain a sense of how the Bible teaches.
I mean, hopefully,
I think that people really appreciate this, because, I mean, one of the things I think readers will walk away from is that there's an avalanche of biblical teaching on the deity of Christ. It's just that maybe they weren't aware.
You need to know where to look.
Yeah, you know where to look. All right.
And we can sort of get into you're right, that essentially each of the chapters is a tranche of the early high Christology stuff. So we'll get to that here in a minute.
So in this early high Christology movement, which you've interacted with and you've kind of distilled the best results for us, there is a language of Christological monotheism. Mm-hmm. There's also language sometimes of Binitarian worship patterns as opposed to Trinitarian worship patterns. You chose the language, which I like, Trinitarian Christology. Why is it important to talk about the Trinity when talking about the deity of Christ?
Coming from the Trinity guy. Within sort of the background of the question, a lot of the really good work, and this is from a whole bunch of scholars. You could even include, say, N.T. Wright and others who, on this topic, are going to be, closer to my perspective, for instance, than on some other topics. And he, among many, used the term such as Christological monotheism to try to describe whenever we see the apostolic circle actually worship Jesus and say these exalted claims about Jesus, coming from most of them, a Jewish background, like Paul. How do you explain how Paul, who grew up as a Pharisee, converted to Jesus and is now praising him as God, worshiping him, that kind of thing? How do you explain that in a Jewish context? So the language Christological monotheism comes out of that. How do monotheistic Jews who confess the oneness of God from Deuteronomy, the Shema, how all of a sudden do they sort of include Jesus in that? That's the big question that the early high Christology movement tries to answer. And the terminology that they kind of settled on, well, it's a Christologically changed monotheism that now sort of includes Jesus in it somehow. And some, like Larry Hurtado, call that a binitarian pattern. So two parts of God. And parts is the wrong word. This is why you write this book, because you get in trouble all the time.
Have a sip of the LaCroix.
I should have some LaCroix.
Yeah.
Actually intentionally said that to show how wrong the language is. The Binitarians were like, oh, there's two parts of God. And so in many respects, it's not objectionable language based on what they're trying to assess. They're trying to say, how do we all of a sudden have the worship of Jesus? And so I get that, who was a guy walking around Palestine and doing things. And so I don't necessarily, properly qualified, I don't object to the language, but I don't think it's ultimately helpful, especially for lay people, because it's just confusing. And so with lots of insight from you, I landed on Trinitarian Christology, because what that's trying to get at is that I am focusing specifically on Christology. So this isn't a book that's only about the Holy Spirit. It's not about God the Father per se. It's mainly about the second person. But you can't understand who the Son of God is, I mean, even just calling him Son of God,
right,
without reference to the fullness of the triune God. If they are truly one, three in one, then you can't talk about Jesus without reference to the other two persons. And so, for lack of any sort of better term or clear term, Trinitarian Christology, which sounds almost redundant, is actually pointing at something that actually Christology must be Trinitarian for it to be correct.
Yeah.
Because there's something essential to the Father and Spirit relations that if you cut that out and just focus on Binitarianism, you're missing something very essential. So that's where I landed, have a whole chapter devoted to fleshing things out in the Trinitarian direction. It's not the only thing I do, but that's a key part of what I do. So hopefully that's more helpful language. It's clunky, but it's hopefully more clear than some of the other language that's used in some of the scholarship.
Yeah, and I think that, if the subtitle gets to the main thing you're doing, how the New Testament teaches us that Jesus is God, I think this point in some ways helps us see the connection between the way the New Testament talks about Jesus as divine and how the early church eventually confessed it, because Trinity and Christology as doctrines developed together, right? It wasn't just kind of abstract reflection.
Yeah, figure out the Christology and then, wait a second.
Yeah, we're reflecting on Christ's person and work as our Savior, and who must he be to save us, and so forth. So that's great. Yeah. So give us a brief overview of the chapters and of the argument of the book. Take us through kind of how you accomplished this thesis.
And it's a short book. It clocks in at 125 pages intentionally. And you've written a shortish book on the Trinity recently. And so I'm assuming you had a similar experience. It's actually a lot easier to make all these big arguments and write a lot. It's much harder to say, okay, I want to do this 100 pages and actually cover what I want to cover. And so the real challenge was, how do I take all this has been done? How do I take an 800-page book by Larry Hurtado and a 400-page book by this person and somehow turn that into literally 2 paragraphs? And so that's one of the overarching themes, is I want to crystallize everything down to the essence of what an average layperson or Bible student needs to know. And so with that in mind, the basic argument is that what we now know as later Trinitarian Christology, as captured in the creeds, wasn't a late evolution. The Cappadocians and Athanasius, those guys didn't sort of invent it. And for that matter, some second century early church father didn't invent it, that it goes all the way back to the first followers of Jesus. In fact, it goes back to Jesus himself, and in certain respects, it goes back all the way to the Old Testament. In other words, I'm trying to, and I've mentioned Fred Sanders in a footnote. Fred was here, as you know, a couple years ago, and this is in the aftermath. This will all make sense in a minute. In the aftermath of the whole Trinity throwdown from a few years ago.
Right.
And when he had lunch with us at our faculty lunch, he said, we've done a ton of stuff at the dogmatic level, going back to the creeds. What do the creeds say about Christology in particular? Right. He said, what now needs to happen, and as you know, I've already drafted the book, what now needs to happen is let's take it the next step back to the text. And so, I was happy that he was willing to endorse the book, because what the book is trying to do is connect those dots. Yeah. Where do we see signs? And as you mentioned, it's an avalanche of things that bridge that gap from 30 AD to the creeds. And so the thesis of the book is the the Trinitarian Christology that we confess goes back to the pages of the New Testament and even before then. So that's the basic thesis. The way I get at it is 6 different ways that we can trace that out. Yeah. And so the introductory chapter, I covered the humanity of Jesus, because you can't separate that out, although I'm specifically focusing on the divinity. So I do touch on that, but it's not the point of this book. The first chapter deals with preexistence. And so preexistence is a fancy word for if Jesus is actually fully divine in the way Orthodox Christianity has always affirmed it. What do we mean by that? Well, it's not like, Pharaoh was quasi-divine. It's not Julius Caesar was divinized, or Augustus. That's not what we mean. What we mean is he's eternally divine. And therefore, he didn't come into existence in Bethlehem in the manger. There was a pre-incarnate, a pre-fleshly existence. And that wasn't something that was invented later. That is even something that Jesus gives us signs that he's aware of his own existence. He gives signs that he existed as a divine, but not yet in-fleshed person before he came into the world. So the first chapter deals with where do we see this in the Gospels? Where do we see this in the writings of Paul? Where do we see this in Jesus' own description of his own relationship to God and where he came from and so forth? All the different evidence that says, no, Jesus had a point of existence that is eternity past, prior to a point in time in which he took on flesh. So that's the first chapter.
And so give us some examples from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because folks usually think of the Gospel of John as teaching
either John or Paul. Yeah. So generally speaking, folks will say, okay, John 1 at the beginning was the Word. That's the most famous one. And obviously that's a huge one.
Right.
And then a couple passages in Paul. And so I do cover that.
Yep.
But in terms of the Gospels, there's a few key places that I go through where one major pattern is this notion that Jesus, whenever he talks about, I have come to do something that has really a global scope, or a almost universal scope. I have come to be a ransom for many. And that's different than I have come for dinner.
Right.
The coming that he gives awareness of, and even when demons recognize, like, wait a second, have you come to throw us into the abyss? They know who he is, right? He's come from outside the world. It's not that he came down from Nazareth and is hanging out with us. He came from somewhere outside the world to do something that impacts the whole world. That's one of the key ones. And there's a few key passages where when he says, I have come, it presupposes the starting point is being outside the world and outside the present time. So that's a key place. And that's largely drawing on the work by my own doctoral supervisor, Simon Gathercole's book on that. And so I try to take his big book and, okay, can I do this in a page? Right. And so that's kind of how the book goes. And there's a few other key passages that suggest the same thing. And then I'll just run through quickly the other chapters. So first chapter, pre-existence. Second chapter is the way both the Father and the Son articulate a special sonship that Jesus has. Kings in the ancient world, even David and so forth, they're called God's son. And that's in many respects true for Jesus as a king. But there's more than that. And so I go through the evidence for a unique kind of sonship that is what we mean by calling him Son of God in a creedal sense. Third chapter is how do the New Testament authors use the Old Testament to portray Jesus as the God of Israel, which is quite a profound statement. You know, whenever they want to prove to their Jewish opponents, for instance, that Jesus is not just a messianic king, but that he's more than that, they actually go to the Old Testament to do that, which means that Jesus is not just like, oh, he got promoted to be God. That's neat. It's no, he was actually already the God of Israel. And so they apply, they'll take a passage from the Old Testament that refers to Yahweh, if I can use that term, and they'll apply it to Jesus. Or they'll use certain things that only God does, such as creation, and they say Jesus is creator. And those are some of the patterns that we see.
Right.
So a lot of really interesting, so probably my favorite chapter is the use of the Old Testament actually to articulate the deity of Jesus. The fourth chapter is all the signs from the New Testament. This is largely drawing on Larry Hurtado's work, where the followers of Jesus when he walked the earth and the next generation actually worship him through prayer, through singing, through bowing down, doing things in his name, and so forth. And you would never do that for King David. You wouldn't do that for Abraham or Moses. That would violate any Jewish conviction about who you're actually supposed to worship. But somehow, even at the very end of Luke 24, they're worshiping Jesus in a full sense. I mean, they're sort of putting their money where their mouth is. Right. Not only do we have these high claims about Jesus, but we actually act on them and worship him as God. So that's the fourth chapter. Fifth chapter is the one where I get into more fully the Trinitarian side of it. The relationship between Jesus and the Spirit and the Father and Jesus, and their mutual relations. And so surprisingly, that's not just like Augustine that invented that. There's a ton of stuff in the New Testament that either presupposes that or directly states it. So I'll go through that evidence, and then I land, somewhat surprisingly but intentionally, chapter 6 is, where does the New Testament actually call Jesus Theos, or God? I don't start there because you can use Theos, you can use the word God even today, rock songs or whatever, you're a God or whatever. You can use it in a lower sense. And so even if you said, oh, look, the New Testament calls Jesus God 5 times, that doesn't necessarily prove the point. You have to know, what do they mean by that when they call him God? And so that's why I saved that for last. I go through 7 places where I think we can hang our hat on that, yes, absolutely, whether you agree with them or not, you can't deny that Hebrews, 1 Timothy, et cetera, that they're actually predicating God to Jesus. And then I go through a few others that are complicated because of manuscript evidence and that kind of thing. And so I put them out there. And then I conclude by going through the big 4. Maybe that's, you could sort of start there, but I end there. The big 4 passages where I think that really cover all of this in a really neat way. Philippians 2, Colossians 1, John 1, and Hebrews 1, where you see basically all of these patterns show up in one set of verses that are the go-to, I think, ultimately. If you wanted to pick 4 to go to, those are the ones to really study and work hard on. So that's the outline.
And it's a great book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you should read it. I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to take some questions from those of us who are joining us today. So you did write this book for a broader audience, and in your own ministry, you work during the week with seminary students, graduate students who are taking biblical languages, taking other theology courses, and you can address these things on one level in the classroom, but you're also a pastor. And you preach on a regular basis, you teach Sunday school, small groups, and all these other things. How has your work on how the Bible teaches that Jesus is God, how has that shaped the way you teach and preach the Bible as a pastor and as a preacher? Yeah,
and in fact, it's almost more the other way around, but I'll answer that question directly. I think what I try to do, or how it's impacted me, is maybe probably a couple of different answers. One is a higher confidence that as an ordained minister, there are certain confessions, so forth, that I adhere to. And one of the neat things about this kind of work is that it puts a lot of legs underneath those confessions, so that whenever I'm teaching and preaching at River Oaks, for instance, from a Westminster perspective, right, it's not that I don't feel like I have to retreat behind the confession. I hope it's true. Yeah. Or whenever we do the Apostle Creed or Nicene Creed at church, it's not like, well, we sort of just accept this because the church says we have to. It's like, no, I've done the work, and it's more than true. Right? Like, we can even say more. And so in terms of confidence, it helps. Even recently, I've done some thinking on, okay, what would the pre-existence of Jesus do to my preaching ministry? I hadn't really thought about that before writing this book. You know, the fact that, you know, generally when we preach, we're kind of driving towards the cross, and that's fine. But okay, if actually Jesus existed before he even took on flesh, when I'm preaching the Old Testament, how do I pick that up? Because it's true. And so that's been interesting and stretching to think about that. But the genesis of the book is actually the other way around. Not only did this material actually start in Sunday school, so I taught all through this stuff in Sunday school, testing it out and fine tuning it. And I've been doing it in lectures and that kind of thing. And I essentially the outline of the book is what I taught through at River Oaks. But my interaction with the flock is, I think, what gives me the passion to say, in fact, my blog is called this, to connect all this stuff that is done at the academic level, both good and sometimes critical stuff that we can still learn from and react to. How do I connect that to the pew? And vice versa. And so actually trying to week in and week out bridge the gap. It's easy to be in sort of intelligentsia world here. How do I actually communicate these very important truths to people who are trying to pay the bills and get kids to school and all that kind of stuff? How do I make this matter to them who aren't the 1% who get to come to seminary? And so that more than anything actually shaped how I wanted to do the book, and sort of keep footnotes to a minimum, stick to the biblical evidence, avoid crazy side trails that I could get into but didn't want to, because I was like, this is what I want them to focus on. And so more of the ministry impacted the book. I mean, the book impacted the ministry too. There's a mutual thing. So that's kind of how it all came together.
That's great. And I mean, at the end of the day, all the riches of Scripture belong to all of God's people.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to teach our students. And that's what we have in professors who model that. And so really grateful for you, Greg, and grateful for this book. All right.
Let's take some questions.
Let's take some questions. I've got them here, I think, on my phone. Yes. All right. In your experience, how have you seen the average believer question Jesus' divinity, perhaps even unknowingly?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Oftentimes it is unknowing. A lot of times it will be, you know, in Sunday school, even our own kids do this. Like, okay, God is Jesus. Like, well, okay, that's true-ish. I think a lot of times it's an unintentional sloppiness of categories and that kind of thing that folks fall into. Like we would call it modalism or some other fancy term for it, but it's basically just kind of not really knowing the nuances, and coupled with that, kind of a fear that you're going to mess up, just like I did earlier.
Right.
And you hammered me for it. That it's a complicated doctrine, as you know, the fullness of the triune God, and as a layperson, that can be pretty intimidating. Justification's hard enough, let alone Trinity. And so I think a lot of folks just sort of shy away from the doctrine for fear of making mistakes, or they simply just don't know. In terms of most common mistakes, there's kind of two ditches that have always been there. One is he's just a human teacher,
right?
And then the other is essentially downplaying the humanity of Jesus at all. And I wouldn't want people. That's why I address it. I don't want people to read this book and say Jesus is, for lack of a better term, sort of only divine, and that has a kind of distortion to it as well. I think a lot of folks basically operate as if he's only a Messiah, and because we hammer that so hard in the church. And so I want to affirm that's true, and I've mentioned this at some point in the book, he is the Jewish Messiah, saving us from sins and that kind of thing, but he's clearly more than that. In fact, the more than shapes what it means for him to be Messiah. Right. And so I think probably if I had to put my finger on where folks have an insufficient Christology just in the general pew, it's probably he's just a human Messiah, and I'm comfortable with that, and he saved me from my sins, and they just don't really it's just sort of a lack of clarity about the divinity and how to work all that out. So, and I don't profess to do that in this book, but I think that's probably the biggest weakness that most probably evangelical folks would have.
Yeah.
And maybe not even realize it, because we hit Christ so much that we miss divine Son.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because I think you almost said this exact thing, but Lifeway and Lanier just published another State of Theology.
Yeah, so I quoted the 2018 version of that, and then they just came out.
Yeah,
with 2020.
and so this is a survey of evangelical Christians, and one of the questions they ask, Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. And you're supposed to say, do you agree or disagree? And apparently 51% of evangelicals agree with the statement. So,
and to me, that says I'm doing something wrong as a pastor.
Yeah.
Fundamentally. Right. And that's where, like, if any of my folks at River Oaks Church answer to that question, then I have completely failed. Yeah. Because we're doing something wrong in our, and it could be we're so focused on atonement and the cross that we miss the other stuff. Right. That could be the root of it, where we're just giving them Jesus as Passover lamb, sacrificial atonement. And that's all true, and that's super important. But it's not surprising that if that's all we hammer, then over half of the people in our flocks don't even affirm that he's God, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, the weight and value of his death is tied to who it is. Yeah. All right, got another question here. What might some of the pastoral implications be of offering prayer to Jesus as you talk about, they got a page number, page 92,
right?
For corporate worship and for the average believer. So pastoral implications of praying to Jesus in corporate worship, pastoral implications of praying.
Yeah, it's a common question, and I'm supposed to write a blog on this at some point.
Maybe this is your editor.
Yeah, maybe. Is it appropriate to pray to Jesus? It's a really interesting question. I mean, assuming we're on the same page here, that's always been kind of a question. Do we only pray to the Father through the Son by the Spirit? And I would say, yes, that's probably the normative pattern, and that seems to be the pattern Jesus gives us. That said, it's undeniable that in Acts chapter 1, in 1 Corinthians, a few other places, they actually do pray to the Son. And that has, I think, enormous implications. I think that's one key element, that he is fully God and he is in the second person. But in terms of pastoral implications, what I try to do, like if I'm doing a pastoral prayer, which I do once a month, I try to be explicit to make my prayers Trinitarian. I think it's easy to be lazy. And it's not wrong just to pray to the Father. I think that's fine. I think that's the Old Testament pattern, by and large. So I'm not saying that's bad, but what I do try to do as a Christology guy is when I'm praying to be explicit in addressing the fullness of God. Yeah. And that worship belongs to the triune God, and the worship as expressed in singing, as in prayer, and so forth. And that it is justifiable to actually pray to Jesus by name. I think he actually says that, when you pray to me in my name, in John. Yeah. So it doesn't mean you only do that. I think there's some flexibility here and so forth, the richness of it, but I think it's a valid thing to do. And one of the things that I think that we can be guilty of in the Reformed world is God the Father is God. We don't mean this, but we signal this. Jesus is the atoning sacrifice, and Spirit is what Pentecostals do. We don't mean to do this, but we do. We signal this. And so I'm trying my best to say, no, Spirit is here. Even in Presbyterian worship, we can have the Holy Spirit.
That's amazing.
And, yeah, I know. And so I'm trying to kind of bring that to bear, even just when I pray from the front, or when I preach, I'm trying to bring the fullness to bear as a way to model that. But it takes time to retrain. And I mean, I have to be retrained myself to think that way, to train my kids that way. So, but that's probably one of the key ways. Like, I think we can pray to Jesus. And through Jesus and in his name, all the above, because that's the patterns we see in the New Testament.
Yeah. I've been reading through Mark's gospel right now, and the patterns in terms of how Jesus interacts with people are remarkable, and the questions, who is this, and the awe that the people often express. But one thing that stands out now, just thinking through this conversation, is how many times people are asking Jesus for things in the Gospels, and how the writers, in some sense, probably are meant to convey that as an example. Yeah. Look at what people ask Jesus for.
And the whole pattern of Acts is everything's done in his name.
Exactly.
And all the
Exactly.
And he's on. And when they cast lots to select the replacement for Judas, they pray to Jesus because he picked the first 12.
Yeah.
It's like right away. I mean, he's barely left the scene, and they're already doing that. So.
He said, sorry, Phoenician woman. She's praying when she asked Jesus to help her.
Yeah. So
that's awesome. Okay. Uh, Time for one or two more questions. Here's another one. Uh, do our historical creeds and standards summarize the biblical data in a way that sufficiently answers whatever views are going around today? Do we need to say more? Good question.
It's a good question. I think there's always space to, a creed can't say everything. And especially the shorter ecumenical ones are all, I mean, they're short. They can't, and I'm just trying to touch the top of the trees. There's plenty of other much longer books. And so one of the great things about biblical truth is that it's bottomless. And I'm talking about true truth. It's there's a bunch of other false truths, but even just true truth is bottomless, right? You can never plumb the full depths of God. And so, and I don't think the authors of the creeds are pretending, or the confessions are pretending to say this is exhaustive for everything for all time. I think what it seems like, especially like the Westminster Divines and so forth, they're trying to do is say, the term I used to use in business, it's a minimally sufficient articulation of what is true. Like this is, it's probably more than that, but this is in a nutshell, what the Bible teaches. It doesn't rule out the need to flesh that out. So I have commentaries on confessions and so forth. So, so I think we need to approach the creeds and confessions as sufficient, as accurate, and of course we all have our quibbles with them, but as authoritative, in the church tradition sense, not in the scriptural sense. But you and I both and others are still digging, and we're not trying to replace them, but we're trying to elaborate on them.
Right.
And so I think they leave plenty of space to flesh all this stuff out. And certainly even the people who wrote them did. I think it's a different question to say, do we need more creed-like things? I know there's kind of been a modern movement to make more statements and add to. I don't honestly have a dog in that fight. So fine. If you want to, go for it, but that's not really kind of where I camp out.
So no hot takes.
I'm not going to opine on that. What do we need more statements of Christology, what have you? I don't care. To be honest with you, it's fine if you want to go for it.
All right.
Well, I think what we have is sufficient, and then just buy my book. That's all you need to do.
No hot takes this afternoon. Yeah. All right. One more question. I think this will be our last one, and then we're going to have you draw some names. Can this book be used as a tool and resource both for non-believers, for example, Muslims, and believers to teach them the truths of Christ's divinity, or is it really more appropriate just for believers?
I would hope, I explicitly wrote it to have that kind of broader audience. And Islam is something that I'm somewhat familiar with and have done some research on. And actually, one of the chapters, I actually get directly into the issue of shirk and the issue of the sonship of Jesus being a huge stumbling block for your average Muslim, and apologetically a huge minefield. And so my hope would be that if someone is skeptical about the claims of Christianity, and they've read some Bart Ehrman or others, Maurice Casey and others that would be in the low Christology club, my hope would be that this would be a straightforward place they could go to really get close to the text and kind of cut through the secondary debates and arguments. Because I fundamentally, I try not to even say, so-and-so says this, some scholar. That's in the footnotes and very limited to that. I'm saying this is what Paul and Jesus and so forth. And so if they really want to get close to the primary evidence, I hope that this is a good resource, because that's where they need to go fundamentally. Their issue isn't going to be some secondary scholar somewhere who's probably dead. It's actually, what does the Bible teach? And so my hope would be that it would have a benefit to a Muslim, a skeptic, Jehovah's Witness, what have you, where they would give it a chance and say, okay, what does the Bible actually say? Let me cut through some of the misconceptions that sometimes come up in apologetic circles, even dealing with this. Do they call Jesus God? That's a huge issue apologetically. And I'm like, okay, yes, but there's more than that. And so I hope that could be helpful to not just a Christian reader, but to a non-Christian reader as well. I think it's time to draw.
And I'll just affirm, as someone who has read the book, and this is true of you more broadly, but Greg is such a clear communicator that this would be a great book, not only for using maybe in a central class or a small group, but I do think that if an unbeliever was inquiring about these questions, it's definitely something you could put in somebody's hand. Definitely something you could say, let me sit down and let's, meet once a week over coffee, discuss the chapters sequentially.
Because I'm fundamentally trying to get folks to go open their Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
Like there's plenty of stuff out there on go open the Nicene Creed or go look at Augustine or what have you, and that's all fine. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But when you're having that conversation with the skeptical 20-year-old on a college campus,
yeah,
with all due respect to the patristic studies, that's probably kind of second year. Like, let's go to Mark, right? Let's just start there and get back to the basics. So I hope it's a resource that's not just like, let me read it once, but like, where are the 15 passages where divine son stuff comes up? And so hopefully that'll be a benefit.
Yeah, no, I think it empowers people to share these things.
And it's short enough to be readable.
Definitely. All right. So we need to do some drawings, and so we're going to draw 5 names here out of the Greg Lanier mug, and we will send you a copy if your name is drawn.
All right, number 1. Oh, good. This is not intentional. Zach Pennington.
Zach Pennington. All right, Zach. Congratulations.
I would have picked that if I could have seen it.
I know. We're going to have to look into the process.
All right, second. Luke Pride.
Luke Pride. All right, Luke.
It's been a while, Luke. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, so I'm not looking. I'm not just intentionally picking RTS alumni, but that's all the more reason to come to RTS.
It is. There's an affinity,
I got a theme here, Brian John.
Oh, man. Okay.
Good times. 3 hybrid students.
That's awesome.
The hybrid MDiv. Something you should look into. Promise this isn't intentional. If Larry and Pat Lanier show up. Steve Kang, there we go.
Steve,
we miss you, Steve. And then lastly but not least, I'll look away so this all looks legit. Elizabeth Adams.
All right. So Zach, Luke, Brian, Steve, and Elizabeth, congratulations. Glad you're here with us. And we're going to be sending you a copy of Greg's great book in the mail.
I'll even sign it.
Oh, yeah. We can sign it. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us today. This has been our first Meet the Author event for the fall. We've got a few others coming down the pipe, and we will be sure to post information and send out information about those dates and times in the near future. Thank you also, Greg, for taking the time to meet with us.
Yeah, thank you.
And one last time, is Jesus truly God? How the Bible teaches the divinity of Christ.
The answer to that question is yes.
It's a great book. You should read it. Thanks, everyone. God bless.